happy to welcome you to this, our last class in the series of winter Bible classes for 2022. And I want to thank all of you for your interest and for your coming and your encouragement in the class, and I hope that my limited ability has been somewhat helpful to you in studying. I have corrected the mess that was made of the outline last week, beginning on page 20. And I want to just briefly review that material before we move on to try to get it in order for you so it makes sense. Beginning in verses 14 through 17, we have the law of festivals. And in verse 14, we mentioned that 3 feasts are to be kept unto Jehovah each year. And you see that there, and you also see it in Exodus 34 and Deuteronomy 16. Now this is the first mention of the 3 annual feasts. So from here on, Israel is supposed to be keeping these 3 annual feasts. Remember, we're at Sinai. God intends them to leave Sinai, go directly to Canaan, and take the land. So these would be observed in Canaan. And that's why they're set up here. And we mentioned that this provides a cohesiveness for the nation. They're coming to the central sanctuary 3 times a year. In verse 15, we have the Feast of Unleavened Bread. 7 days unleavened bread is to be eaten, and we mentioned that this would be Abib 15 to 21. And I spent some time, and you have the notes where we talked about in the New Testament often the days of unleavened bread included Passover and this feast. Passover would begin Abib 14, and then the Feast of Unleavened Bread, Abib 15 to 22. Then in verse 16, we have the Feast of Harvest at the first gathering of the crops, and the Feast of Ingathering at the end of the agricultural year. And the Feast of Harvest would be the offering of the first gathered crops, and the Feast of Ingathering, the offering of the last gathered crops. And this feast was kept in the month of Ethanim, days 15 to 21, and also called the Feast of Booths or Tabernacles. In verse 17, we again read, 3 times in the year, all your males shall appear before the Lord Jehovah. 3 times, the Hebrew word regale means a foot. So 3 times would mean 3 feet. And one writer said, may suggest pilgrim festivals to which they marched on foot in the year all the males were to appear. And when they appeared, they would recognize 2 things, the sovereignty of Jehovah and the covenant. Now these pilgrim festivals, those who are members here at Smyrna, hopefully you will remember that we covered in the book of Psalms those Psalms of Ascent. We talked about, that's very likely, after the return from Babylon, these Jews in caravan form are going up to Jerusalem to worship. And as they approach, they sing these Psalms of Ascent. And we covered each of them. And so this is the idea of those festivals. Then in verse 18 we have the Passover. Do not offer the blood of my sacrifice with leavened bread, nor shall the fat of my sacrifice remain until morning. So do not use leavened bread in the Feast of Passover. And we talked about the fat representing the very choicest parts, the very best that could be given. Now, in Exodus 12:19, we mentioned the sojourner is to keep this feast if he's been circumcised. And that would make him a full proselyte. So go back to Exodus 12. "7 days," verse 19, "no leaven shall be found in your houses, since whoever eats what is leavened, that same person shall be cut off from the congregation of Israel, whether he is a stranger or a native of the land." So that opens up Passover to be kept by those who have been circumcised. Now, the proselyte at the gate would not have been circumcised, and therefore he would not keep the Passover. But the full proselyte would be able to do that. And the fact that there is a restriction indicates that this is the way it is to be regarding particularly the Gentiles that would sojourn among them. And these regulations have been carried out. Verse 44 of chapter 12. "Every man's," verse 43, "no foreigner shall eat it. But every man's servant who is bought for money, when you have circumcised him, then he may eat it. A sojourner and a hired servant shall not eat it." And then he says, "Do it in one house." Verse 48. "When a stranger dwells with you and wants to keep the Passover to Jehovah, let all his males be circumcised, and then let him come near and keep it. And he shall be as a native of the land." And you might want to mark this: "For no uncircumcised person shall eat it." So here's a provision whereby a Gentile brings himself fully under the law. The proselyte at the gate would not eat the Passover because they were not circumcised. So you have that differentiation. And if the law, when we were talking about this in principle, if the law did not apply or appeal to a Gentile, this regulation here wouldn't make sense to me. Why even make a regulation for somebody to whom the law doesn't apply? So again, that's one of the reasons I believe that the law ended, or the patriarchal age ended at Sinai, and this law would be applicable to all. Notice that Jehovah says in chapter 23, verse 18, "It is my feast, my sacrifice." And that stresses the relationship between Jehovah and the feast. This feast was observed sporadically by Israel during the days of the kingdom. 2 Kings 23, verse 22. Now, underscore this idea of the relationship between Jehovah and the feast. That is a background in principle for the relationship between Christ and the Lord's Supper. That's His supper. When we talk about some principles in the New Testament, we talk about the Lord's Day. I believe that's the Greek word kuriakon that's involved there, and it's the day pertaining to the Lord. Remember, John said, "I was in the Spirit on the Lord's day." Revelation 2, or Revelation 1. That's the day that pertains to the Lord. All right, then we have the Lord's Supper. That's the supper that pertains to the Lord. So it stresses His relationship to the feast itself. The bread is to be what kind of bread? Unleavened bread. All right, that's a parallel. Isn't it? And the drink is to be what? Grape juice, the fruit of the vine, that's a parallel. Edersheim, in his book on the temple, says, or his book on the life and times of Jesus the Messiah, I believe, says that there were at least 4 cups that were used during the observance of the Passover. And one of them would be the cup, the drinking that Jesus did when he instituted the Lord's Supper, Matthew 26, 26 to 28. And he said, I won't drink it again until I drink it new with you. That's fellowship. That's a relationship to Christ and the Lord's Supper. And they would be observed where? Drink it new with you in the kingdom. All right? That's the church. So you have the Lord's Supper, observed on the Lord's day in the Lord's house, the church. And you can see that relationship between Christ and the supper. Then in verse 19, you have the law of first fruits. The first of the first fruits of your land you shall bring into the house of Jehovah your Elohim. And so here is the bringing it to the house, which would indicate a storage being brought there for the use of the priests to sustain the priesthood. And you have the sheaf of new barley offered as a wave offering. And then you number 50 days from the offering of the barley sheaf until the Feast of Weeks, or the Feast of Pentecost. And we talked about that from the perspective of Acts 1 and Acts 2. So I believe that brings us down then to where we were, and I hope this is right. I hope I've straightened it out for you, and it makes a little more sense. And I appreciate David and Kimberly helping me with that. I have a lot of fun over it. I give David especially a hard time about finding all my mistakes. But I ask him to do it. It galls me to hand out something that's not right. And so he's trying to help me at least get it right in case anybody wants it after I'm gone. In verse 19, we also have an interesting statement. You find it again in Deuteronomy 14:21. You shall not boil a young goat in its mother's milk. Now, generally, some people say, what does that mean? It means exactly what it says. And that's every bit of information the Lord gave us on that. He didn't explain it. He didn't say, why I'm giving you that law. But, as in the case of a lot of things, they would know. They would understand. When you get to 2 Thessalonians 2, for example, and you read about the man of lawlessness, we don't know who that was. I have an idea as to who I think it might be, but he's not identified. Paul said the man of lawlessness will be revealed. But in chapter 2, he said, when I was there, I told you. So they knew. And that man has been made to be everybody that somebody doesn't like politically. He's the man of sin. And that man is parallel, sadly, because they're not parallel, with the Antichrist. Walking on the treadmill with a Sunday school teacher, one of the denominations here in town one day, and he told me he'd been studying 1 John, and he'd been studying about the Antichrist. And there's this big Antichrist going to come, and at the end time, and it was going to be a great catastrophe. And I said to him just casually, do you know there's more than one Antichrist? And he said, what are you talking about? I said, I want you to go back and read 1 John and look at the S on the end of that word, Antichrists. So he went back and read it and came back the next day and told me he had learned that, but there was still going to be this big Antichrist. Well, once you make your mind up about something, whether it's in there or not, you read it in there. But I don't know what this means. It's probably, you hear that? Probably connected with idolatry among the Canaanites, but that's a guess. He did not tell us why. I thought it was interesting, number 3 on your outline. One writer said, some Jews keep meat products in one refrigerator and milk products in another, and they do not consume meat and dairy products at the same time. So, sometimes tradition.
Kosher.
Sir?
Kosher.
Yeah, sometimes tradition has brought about some of these things that they keep up. They also would not do what I do, eat bacon and drink milk. But this law pertained to something, and we do not know what. All right, any questions or comments that I can answer on that paragraph? All right, we pick up then in verses 20 through 31 on the rewards of obedience. Behold, I send, now look at this, an angel before you to keep you in the way and to bring you into the place which I have prepared. So notice, Jehovah will send the angel. This could very well have been the angel of Jehovah who appeared to Moses at Sinai in Exodus 3:2 and Exodus 14:19. Could be. He doesn't say the angel of Jehovah. He just says, I'm going to send an angel. And there are some things about that. There is, first of all, the idea of the resourcefulness of the angel. Look at verse 23. For my angel, now there's my angel, will go before you and bring you in to the Amorites and the Hittites and the Perizzites and the Canaanites and the Hivites and the Jebusites, and I will cut them off. Now those names represent the 7 nations of Canaan. Generally Amorites, sometimes Canaanites. Remember in Genesis 15, the reason Jehovah said, I will give Abraham, I'll give this land to you, but not now, was what?
The iniquity of the Amorites was not yet full.
The iniquity of the Amorites not yet full. Now that means my long suffering has not yet ended. But at the point at Sinai, the long suffering of Jehovah is about to end. The length of time left in the long suffering of Jehovah for the Canaanites is the length of time it takes the Israelites to go from Sinai into Canaan and conquer it. That's how much time the Canaanites have left. And this angel will go before them. Notice 3 things this angel would do. Verse 20, he would guide them. Look also at verse 23, he shall go before you. Go before you. So Jehovah would be leading them by medium, by this angel who would go before them. Now notice also we've had 2 other symbols of Jehovah's presence among them. What are they?
The cloud and the pillar of fire.
The cloud, and then look at Numbers 10. And verse 33. So they departed from the mountain of Jehovah on a journey of 3 days, and the ark of the covenant of Jehovah went where? before them for the 3 days' journey to search out a resting place for them. So you had the cloud, you had the ark of Jehovah, and you had the angel. All three of those represent Jehovah's presence among them. So he would guide them. In the second place, he would guard them. In verse 20, the angel will keep you. That's the word shalmar that we've seen before. Exercise great care over, guard, protect. By the way, so Jehovah would sustain them. In the third place, he would give to them. The angel would bring them into the place prepared for them by Jehovah. That's said in verse 20 and in verse 23. Go back to Exodus 15. Verses 16 and 17. Fear and dread will fall on them by the greatness of your arm. They will be as still as a stone till your people pass over, O Jehovah, till the people pass over whom you have purchased. You will bring them in and plant them in the mountain of your inheritance, in the place, O Jehovah, which you have made for your own dwelling, the sanctuary, O Lord, which your hands have established. Now, notice here in Exodus 15, connected here with Exodus 23, 20, and 23, that you have a prepared place for a prepared people. Now, there's a principle parallel to that in the New Testament. What is it? I think there are two, but what is at least one of them?
I have gone to prepare a place.
You have heaven.
He said he had gone to prepare a place for me.
All right, so you have the prepared place. Who's going there?
Prepares me.
The prepared people. It's my judgment that the church is a prepared place for prepared people. The Lord doesn't add just everybody to the church. It's only those who obey the gospel. Now, preaching brethren, there are 2 3-point sermons for you to develop. So you have the 3 things the angel would do for them, Jehovah doing for them, and then you have these 3 prepared places for prepared people. And I'll let you develop it. One writer said, the promise of the land may be seen to inspire the legislation and conduct of Moses throughout his career. So now we're talking about the land. Now, what's the background for our talking here about the land? The land. The land promise. Where is it? You're right there. Genesis 12. No, that's the seed promise. Don't guess. When you're in a hole, quit digging. Somebody go back to, all of them go back to Genesis 12. You did the right thing. You just were quiet till you looked it up. Oh, but though the man beside you would learn. Now, I want to stress something here that I think we lose sight of. In 12:3, you have the seed promise, all right? That connects back to what? Genesis 3:15. All right? It connects forward to what?
Jesus.
I'm sorry?
Jesus.
Yeah, and what passage would we use? Galatians 3, where it said the seed as of one, and your seed, which is Christ, I believe is that verse 23, check me out on that. But see, you have that seed promise. Now, it's going all the way through. Don't lose sight of that when you're studying your Old Testament. We're still unfolding the seed promise. Everything that is done in the Old Testament is done in preparation for the fulfillment of the seed promise. All right, in 12:7, somebody read that.
And the Lord appeared unto Abram, said, Unto thy seed will I give this land, and there builded he an altar unto the Lord, who appeared to him.
All right, unto your seed I will give this land. Now there's the land promise. Everything up until the book of Joshua is preparatory to Jehovah fulfilling the land promise. Now, in Leviticus 26 and Deuteronomy 28, he said to them, this land promise is conditional. The only way you get the land is by obedience, and the only way you keep the land is by continued obedience. And if you disobey, I will take you out of the land. Now, in 722 BC, Assyria took the northern kingdom of Israel out of the land, never to come back as a kingdom. Beginning in 605 BC, Babylon took the southern kingdom out of the land for 70 years. But reality is, when you get to Ezra, only about 50,000 of them ever came back. So for all practical purposes, most of the southern kingdom lost the land. But they chose not to come back. They wanted to stay in Babylon. Now, when God gave them the land, Joshua said he's fulfilled the land promise. He did what he said he would do. From Judges forward, it's whether or not they keep the land. In Acts 2, any reference to the land ends. From Pentecost forward, it doesn't matter what that land is, who has that land, what they do in that land. God doesn't care. The land is no longer important. You move from a physical kingdom to a spiritual kingdom, and the land has no significance in the spiritual kingdom. So for us to talk about Palestine being the Holy Land is to misspeak. There's nothing holy about it. It ended at Pentecost. There's no holiness about it. The Jews are not God's chosen people now. Christians are. And God is not going to send Jesus to come back to this earth and reset up the kingdom of Israel and give them the land at end time. Because there won't be any land to give them. 2 Peter 3, 9 and 10, the day of the Lord will come, and when he comes, he's going to burn it up. And that does not mean he's going to renew it and we'll live on it. It's going to be burned up. We need to learn that. The majority of Southern denominationalists are premillennial. And they believe, number one, Israel is God's chosen people. They believe, number two, all this end time stuff is going to happen and God will reset up the kingdom of Israel and give the Jews the land. None of that's going to happen. Now, our foreign policy in America toward Israel is dominated by a false understanding of premillennialism, a false belief in premillennialism. That's why our government bends over 3 times backwards to do anything for Israel. That's why Israel gets the promise. That misunderstanding of the land promise. And when my fellow Georgian was in the White House, he is the only man in my lifetime that tried to practice his religion. And he was strongly premillennial. And when you think of the Camp David Accord with Egypt and Israel, one of the motivating factors behind that was premillennialism. Israel is God's chosen people. So when you understand the land promise, here we are right here. God says, I'm going to give you the land. I promised it. I'm going to give it to you. And you are to go now and take it. All right? The angel's going to do these 3 things for you. That's Jehovah doing them through the angel. Notice in verse 21, though, the people have a responsibility toward the angel. Beware of him, and what kind of conjunction is that? Coordinating that links 2 things of equal standing or equal rank. Beware of him and obey his voice. Do not provoke him, for he will not pardon your transgressions, for my name is in him. Take heed, give great attention to the voice, the words of the angel. They are not to provoke him. How would you provoke him?
Doing against God's will.
Rebelling against his instructions. If they provoke him, he will not pardon their transgressions. Now, that's the Hebrew word hashah. Transgression. It's one of those 3 main Hebrew words that has to do with sin. And hashah means a revolt, a rebellion. That's the emphasis of this word. Hashah designates those who reject God's authority. Predominantly, it's rebellion against God's law and against God's covenant. And it fractures the relationship with Jehovah. So here's a rebellion. But notice this. If you rebel, he will not do what?
Forgive.
What's the implication of that?
That he's deity, because he had the power to forgive.
He had the power to forgive, which means he's deity, which points to his being the angel of Jehovah, which points to his being the Word of John 1:1. I say he won't forgive you if he couldn't. And an ordinary angel couldn't forgive sins. All right, they are not to provoke him, and then they are to respect his authority. Notice, my name is in him. Now, we said that someone's name represented their character. So this is a way of saying that my nature, my essence, my authority is in this angel. And again, that makes him deity. God and his name in Scripture are almost synonymous. You could convert him. And he is never in the Scripture said to set his name in a man. Now it changes at Pentecost, doesn't it? Because who are the people who submit to Christ?
Christians.
The Christians, they have his name. Therefore, they are to have his character of obedience. It doesn't make them deity, but they're to have his character. You belong to Christ. Now, in 22 and 23, you see the reward that will come if they obey. Notice verse 22, if. Obedience is tied to, the reward is tied to obedience on the part of the people. All right? They must listen to the revelation of the angel. This will be hearken unto his voice. Notice this. Do you indeed obey his voice and do all that he speaks?
I speak.
I speak. So there's Jehovah's revelation. And then you do all that I speak, so you live according to that revelation. All right, put it together. What would motivate them to be obedient? See if you can work it out. We have here the revelation. We have here the reward. Obedience allows them to reap the reward. What's going to motivate them? Okay, a little bit more specific. You're correct.
What he had already done for them by getting them there, but also what he's giving them, which is the land of Canaan.
That's a part of it. It's tied with the promises, and then what he's done. Y'all are missing the link here.
Love,
Well, love would be necessary.
yeah,
You're missing the link.
that's the question again.
What would motivate them to be obedient? With this link,
Belief,
huh?
I said belief.
Because it comes how?
Hearing the word of God.
Oh, could have had the 8, right? See that? See that?
Which would be the.
Do you see it?
Which
No,
would be,
keep on.
which would be the angel in the present.
Well, the angel gives the revelation.
Okay.
They listen to the angel, which is Jehovah speaking. All right? The revelation will lead them to the reward. But the only thing that will cause them to obey is faith. Faith comes of
Hearing by the word of God. Promise things of it.
good man. See the link? Now see, we don't always see this in the Old Testament. We reserve that for the gospel. But from Genesis 2 all the way through your Bible, it's the same principle. Genesis 2. Of all the trees of the garden you may freely eat, but don't eat of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. What's going to motivate them to keep the reward and be able to stay in the garden and be blessed, whether or not they believe what God just said. They didn't, what happened? They lost the garden. Same principle. Can you see that? Now this is what I've been saying to you for 16 and a half years. You take these principles all the way through. You start in Genesis and you quit in maps. And you take this principle all the way through. So anytime there's obedience, it's prompted by faith. If it's accepted to God. Anytime. Under patriarchy, Mosaic, or Christian. Faith always comes from God's revelation. and faith always results in the reward that comes through obedience. Questions or comments?
Sometimes people think that faith is something that they only do. It's not a two-part. Sometimes people think faith is just, I believe, or I don't believe. They think it's just what they believe. They don't think it's what they hear, the word faith.
The denominational world believes faith is what I feel right here in my heart. So it's feelings, not intellect. It's emotion, not intellect.
The idea that you're describing there, Paul put bookends in Romans, the faith and obedience, so that people would understand that without obedience, I mean, you have to have faith with obedience.
Have it in Romans 1, Romans 16.
Romans 1:5.
Yes.
16 and 26.
Thank you. So you have obedience, probably to the faith, but obedience of faith in Romans. All right? Other questions or comments here? I need you to see this. You need you to see this. If you're going to understand your Bible, you need to see this.
So there's the faith and there's my faith.
The faith is right there. It's the revelation of God. The scheme, God's scheme of redemption. My faith is my reaction to that revelation that says, I believe it. That's an intellectual thing. I've read it. I've analyzed it. I understand it. I believe it. Let me illustrate. Acts 8. Philip's teaching the eunuch out of Isaiah 52:14 through the end of what we have is 53. All right, the eunuch says, is the prophet speaking of himself or someone else? So Philip begins in that scripture and does what? All right, there's your revelation. He helps him analyze it. His question to the eunuch was what? Do you understand what you're reading? So he helps him analyze it and understand it. All right, now, if this is developed, it will be developed from this, from an understanding of this. So as they go on their way, the eunuch says what? All right, look, water. What does hinder me to be baptized? You don't see the word baptism in that sermon anywhere as it's recorded in Acts 8 until the eunuch asked that question. How did it get in there? That was a part of understanding that Philip preached to in preaching Jesus. That was the application of the principles of Isaiah 53 as it played out in the fulfillment in Christ. All right? What was Philip's statement when the eunuch said, look, water, what hinders my being baptized?
I believe.
If you believe. The only thing that's recorded in that section that Philip used to bring that eunuch to faith, because he said, I believe Jesus Christ is the Son of God, was what?
Revelation.
The revelation of God. Philip didn't work a miracle. You just have the revelation of God. You don't even read about confirmation in that account. You just have revelation. And he brings him to the reward, the remission of his sins, based on his faith. So faith brings about obedience. Now, obedience has to be defined by the covenant under which you're living. What does that covenant define as obedience? So that will change based on the covenant. Questions or comments? This is crucial. And it's my judgment that a lot of our folks don't have this picture. And that's why when they see things in their Bible, they don't see it. They don't see the connection. It's like faith all the way through. the land promise all the way to Joshua. Now I know I may be digging up some roots. This may be new ground, but this to me is crucial. If we get it in the Old Testament, we don't have a problem in the New Testament. Because the Old Testament is full of illustrations of how it works. Make sense? Make me make it clear to you. So that's why the promises are involved. And that's why what I've done for you and will do for you is involved. It all comes down to this right here. How about that? That's 3 sermons. Man, y'all roll it. Y'all gonna have to hunt a lot of poems to go with it. Now, notice 22 and 23, the reward will come as promised. Notice this. But if you indeed obey his voice and do all that I speak, then, see that? So you have an if-then proposition here. Then I will be an enemy to your enemies and an adversary to your adversaries. For my angel will go before you and bring you to these nations. All right? Jehovah will be an enemy. One that's opposite. To be hostile unto their enemies. This meaning is evident in the only non-participial occurrence of the word, Exodus 23:22, where God becomes an enemy to Israel's enemy. What's the background of this?
Abrahamic promise.
Flesh that out.
I'll bless those who bless you and curse them that curse you.
So you're right back in Genesis 12:3. Everyone who was favorable to Abraham and his descendants was blessed by Jehovah. Everyone who was hostile to Abraham and his descendants was blighted or punished by Jehovah. So from 12:3 onward, how a person turned out had to do with his relationship to Abraham and his seed. Because Abraham and his seed represented God. All right? What's going to determine how people turn out in our day?
By the obedience of God's word.
Okay, but in keeping this as a parallel. By what? By their reaction to Christians. Because Christians represent Christ. If they reject you, it's because they've already rejected me. See that? Make sense? See, you have principles. And 12:3 is the dominating principle. And often, and this is what I'm trying to stress, often we'll read 12:3 and we forget it. Okay, God made a promise to Abraham, and Christ is the fulfillment of it, will be. Now I'm going to read the next books, and that doesn't have a thing world to do with that. It has everything to do with it. It's the whole point of it. The unfolding of the scheme of redemption is the unfolding of the promise to Abraham. All right, when you get to Romans 4, Paul will discuss the faith of Abraham. And the problem with national Israel after Pentecost was they did not have the obedient faith of Abraham. In fact, that's what Jesus told national Israel in John 6, 7, and 8. If you had Abraham's faith, you'd believe me. Abraham saw my day and was glad. But you've rejected me. Questions or comments? Jehovah will be an adversary. He will harass and torment their enemy. And this is the act of inciting someone to come to battle. And we're back to Genesis 12:3. Look at Numbers 24 and verse 9. The latter part. Oh, how blessed is he who blesses you, and cursed is he who curses you. Is that Genesis 12:3? So Jehovah will be an adversary. But not only that, verse 23, I will cut them off. You may have a marginal reading, something like, I will annihilate them. I will destroy your enemies. Now he will use the angel as his representative, bring Israel into the land of the enemy, and smite the enemy through Israel. And that should be a closed parenthesis there. All right, questions and comments on that? I'm going to give you the land. We're going to the land. Anyone? All right. In verse 24, you shall not bow down to their what? Their, somebody said something here.
I say God.
All right, what's our word there? Elohim. Shall not bow down to their Elohim, nor serve them, nor do according to their works. Circle it. But you shall utterly overthrow them and completely break down their sacred pillars. Mark utterly and completely. You drop back up to verse 13. All that I've said to you, be circumspect and make no mention of the name of other gods, Elohim, nor let it be heard from your mouth. So don't bow down to idol gods in worship and service. Don't serve those gods, nor carry out their will. Do their works. So you have the obeisance to idol gods is prohibited. Notice the overthrow. You break down these pillars. You destroy them. Destroy idol worship wherever you go. Don't let it linger. Go to Exodus 34. Let's read 12. Take heed to yourself, lest you make a covenant with the inhabitants of the land where you're going, lest it be a snare in your midst. But you shall destroy their altars, break their sacred pillars, and cut down their wooden images. For you shall worship no other Ael there. For Jehovah, whose name is jealous, is a jealous Ael. Lest you make a covenant with the inhabitants of the land, and they play the harlot with their gods and make sacrifice to their gods, and one invites you, and you eat of his sacrifice, and you take of his daughters for your sons, and his daughters play the harlot with their gods, and make your sons play the harlot with their gods. You shall make no molded gods for yourself. So utterly obliterate it. Utterly obliterate it. In 2 Kings 3, verse 1, Now Jehoram the son of Ahab became king over Israel at Samaria in the 18th year of Jehoshaphat, king of Judah, and reigned 12 years. And he did evil in the sight of Jehovah, but not like his father and mother, for he put away the sacred pillar of Baal that his father had made. All right, so Ahab, because of Jezebel and his weakness, had basically given in to Sidonian idolatry. Jehoram came, he didn't do that. He got rid of the Baal worship, but he kept calf worship, which still kept him out of fellowship with God. And I've given you a plethora, that means a whole bunch of other scriptures there that you can study on that point. One writer said, conquerors generally preserve the idols of the conquered nations as trophies of victory. God said, don't you do that. The overflow of idolatry would be symbolized, the overthrow of idolatry would be symbolized by the breaking of the idol pillars, a memorial stone, and then an idol. And so they would set up these columns and dedicate them to their idols. One writer said, little c, as to the Canaanites, Israel was to destroy them, Exodus 23:24, and break up their idols, thus striking at their morale and defeating them. If they had done this, your Old Testament would read differently. If they had completely obliterated Canaan, the Canaanites, and completely destroyed the idols, the rest of the Old Testament from the book of Joshua would be a different reading. Which tells you by implication they didn't do that. So get rid of the idols. So the 10 words and the book of the covenant prohibited idolatry. Now you get rid of idolatry, you get rid of immorality, because they're tied together all the way through the Bible. Questions or comments? All right, in 25 through 31, you have the abundant blessings from Jehovah. Israel is to serve Jehovah, and that service will be abundantly blessed. So here you have God's revelation. Through faith, they are to be obedient to Him and serve Him, and He will give them the reward. Give me a New Testament passage to Christians that basically summarizes this for us.
Revelation 2:10.
Oh, what does that say? Is that what you were thinking of?
Be unfaithful and do it.
All right, you be faithful. What motivates faithfulness? What does faithful mean?
Full of faith.
Full of faith. Faith motivates faithfulness. You be faithful, I'll give you the crown of life. That summarizes that principle. By the way, that was said to Smyrna. The one in Asia Minor, literally, to us by principle. All right? Notice verse 25. So you shall serve Jehovah your Elohim. So you are to serve Jehovah and make Him your God. Look at Deuteronomy 6:13. You shall fear Jehovah your God and serve Him, and shall take oaths in His name. Does that kind of sound like maybe It was used in the New Testament somewhere. Maybe. No. You shall serve Jehovah your God.
And him only,
I'm sorry?
and him only shall you serve.
And that's where?
Matthew 4, about
10.
10.
In what? What's the scene there?
The temptations of Jesus.
In the devil tempting Jesus. Now notice, this is said to Israel before they ever go to Canaan. Jesus said, it is written, and he used the perfect tense there, which means it has been written in the past, and it stands written now. Has the same force. You shall worship Jehovah your God, and him only shall you serve. So you cannot have any idols. Now, that includes cake and pie and cookies, whatever else are the goodies as we take a break at this point.
Thanks.
Go ahead.
Before we take a break, I think
We are moving now on the abundant blessings from Jehovah. Israel's to serve Jehovah and make him their Elohim. In verses 25 to 33, based upon Israel's service, Jehovah will bless Israel abundantly. Verse 25, so you shall serve Jehovah your God, and he will bless you, or bless your bread and your water. And I will take sickness away from the midst of you. Jehovah your God and I, same thing. So he blesses their sustenance, their bread and their water. Now, that would have to do with the early rains and the latter rains and the production of their crops. If their grain does not make, they don't have any bread. And the grain will not make if they don't get the early rains and latter rains. And Jehovah controls that. The early rains and latter rains, about which we've not yet read, parallel or contrast with, I think would be a better way to say it, the Nile overflowing in Egypt and irrigating the crops. They're coming out of a land where they have served 215 years, and they've seen the Nile overflow, and that's how those crops are fertilized. You're going into a land where you don't have a Nile River. Jordan can't do that. And if they don't get the early rains and latter rains, then they have drought, and everything dies. So Jehovah says, I'll be sure you get what you need. He says, I will protect you from sickness. So these plagues, he will later say to them that if you'll be faithful to me, none of these diseases that you saw in Egypt will ever come on you. And I believe it was Macmillan that wrote a little paperback called None of These Diseases. It's an interesting read. And in verse 26, no man shall suffer, or no one shall suffer miscarriage or be barren in your land. I will fulfill the number of your days. You will continue. No miscarriages. No animal will cast her young. That's a different word from the one we had back in chapter 21. There would be no barrenness. So your women are going to be productive. That's interesting, because if a Jewish woman was barren, what did she think? That God had withheld blessings and had brought reproach on her. Remember Elizabeth and Mary, when they found out they were going to have a child, one of them said, Jehovah's taken away my reproach. So they would not be barren. They would live full lives. Live good lives. Look at Isaiah 65 verse 20. This is God's righteous judgment working. He says, "No more shall an infant from there live but a few days, nor an old man who has not fulfilled his days. For the child shall die 100 years old, but the sinner, being 100 years old, shall be accursed." Now, 100 years old there is not literal. It's figurative, or completion. And so there will be a reproductive abundance. The command to Adam and Eve before they sinned was to do what?
Be fruitful, multiply.
Fill the earth. Old King James word replenish means fill. Fill the earth. All right? Productivity was promised. Sin brought the problems with that. But had they remained faithful. And then verses 27 to 31, he will drive out the Canaanites and give Israel the land. I will send my fear before you. I will cause confusion among all the people to whom you come, and will make all your enemies turn their backs to you. So he will send his terror before Israel. In chapter 35 of the book of Genesis, and in verse 5, when Jacob and his family are moving, they buried their idols in the oak by the terebinth of Shechem. Verse 5 says, "And they journeyed, and the terror of Elohim was upon the cities that were all around them, and they did not pursue the sons of Jacob." The terror of Jehovah, of Elohim here, was on those cities. And he said, "I'll send my terror before you." Now in Exodus 15, in the Song of Moses, and in verse 16, we read, "Fear and dread will fall on them. By the greatness of your arm, they will be as still as a stone, till your people pass over, O Jehovah, till the people pass over whom you have purchased." He will discomfit, he says. Basic meaning of this word means to harass, trouble, creating panic. And that's why the New King James says, "I will cause confusion." The idea of creating panic among these people. Now go to Joshua. Chapter 2. You remember Joshua sent out 2 spies to Jericho, and they came to Rahab, who is described by, in my judgment, what she used to be, but the connotation had stuck with her, as a harlot. And she takes these men in and she hides them. And in verse 8, before they lay down, she came up to them on the roof and said to the men, now I want you to notice this. What? There's no doubt there. I know that, and what name does she use? The covenant name. I know that Jehovah has given you the land. Now they haven't taken it yet. That the terror of you has fallen on us. And that A-double-L, biggest little word in our Bible, that all the inhabitants of the land are faint-hearted because of you. Now I want you to notice verse 10. For we have what? I want you to connect some thoughts there. She said, we know, I know. Based on what? What they'd heard. And that's what Jehovah said in Exodus 9, about verse 12 to Pharaoh. My name shall be declared in the earth. That's why I've let you stand. We've heard. And she names what all the Lord did. Verse 11, as soon as we heard, our hearts melted. Neither did there remain any more courage in anyone because of you. For Jehovah your God, He is God in heaven above and on earth beneath. Now, that tells me, tied to, well, just hold your finger there and go to Hebrews 11. And verse 31. Well, the first two words. By faith. The harlot Rahab did not perish with those who did not believe when she had received the spies with peace. From where does faith come? All right? She said, I know. I know based on what we've heard. I know based on what we heard is what Jehovah did through you to all these kings and the Red Sea crossing. Now the Red Sea crossing would be the what of the what?
Confirmation of the revelation.
Absolutely. Now we heard about that. We heard about that confirmation that Jehovah is God. And she said, I'm operating on what? On faith. By faith, Rahab. All right? You have God's revelation, you have her faith, and she reaped the reward. Same question. And I believe Rahab is a proselyte of the gift. She said, Jehovah is God. That's the same kind of statement that Naaman will later make in 2 Kings 4. I know there's no other God except the God of Israel. Naaman will say. All right, so he says, I'll discomfort those people. He will make all their enemies turn their backs to Israel. Yes, the parentheses ought to be turned around the other way. I will cause confusion among all the people to whom you come, and will make all your enemies turn their backs to you. So they'll run away from Israel. And Don has waited, I don't know how many years, for 4 years, for me to read this next verse. And I will send hornets before you, which shall drive out the Hivite, the Canaanite, and the Hittite from before you. Now, they aren't bees, they're stinging wasps. Now, go to Deuteronomy 7.
Did you say something?
Deuteronomy 7, verse 20. Moreover, Jehovah your God will send what? The hornet. Singular here. Among them until those who are left who hide themselves from you are destroyed. The Hebrew word for hornets is a collective noun. The writer draws a picture of some swarm of insects pursuing the fleeing natives of Canaan. His power in Canaan will be as great as it was in Egypt. So go back to chapter 8 of Exodus. And verse 20 beginning. And you have the flies, 20 through 32. And he sends these flies, swarms of flies. Now, the question comes, is this literal? Is Jehovah going to literally send hornets and drive out the people? Well, one writer said this. This is scarcely to be taken literally. There seems to be no reasonable doubt that the word is used figuratively for a cause of terror and discouragement. Terror and discouragement. All right? Turn to Joshua 24:12. We just read that. Or read something similar to that in Deuteronomy. But in Joshua 24:12, I sent the hornet before you, which drove them out from before you, also the 2 kings of the Amorites, but not with your sword and your bow. All right, he defeated those kings, but not with your sword and your bow. I did that. Through some kind of a miraculous interposition. So the hornets refer to some interposition of God, however he chose to do it. Could he have literally sent hornets and driven those people out?
Yes.
Absolutely. Just like he did flies.
Was, I started to say, was the flies then actual flies?
Yes.
Well, I was just thinking if there was flies over there, then why wasn't there normally?
So he'd have no trouble doing that, would he? Roper quotes Harrison. And he says, hornets refer to God's miraculous intervention on his people's behalf in dispossessing the indigenous inhabitants of the Promised Land. In these passages, the hornet seems to be used in a dramatic, metaphorical sense to show how God's onslaught would render the Canaanites immobile, just as the hornet's sting paralyzed its victim. All right, turn to Exodus 33:2. All right, he's told us what the hornet will do. It will drive out these nations. Verse 2, I will send my what? Angel before you, and I will drive out the Canaanite, and the Amorite, and the Hittite, and the Perizzite, and the Hivite, and the Jebusite. Turn one chapter over to 34:11. Observe what I command you this day. Behold, I am driving out from before you the Amorite, and the Canaanite, and the Hittite, and the Perizzite, and the Hivite, and the Jebusite. So the very same thing the hornet is said to do, or the hornets, the angel of Jehovah is said to do, and Jehovah himself is said to do. So whatever the means, literally or not, doesn't really matter. The point is, this is Jehovah driving those people out in a way that Israel by itself could not have done it. So not only were they to go in and fight, but Jehovah says, you go fight, but I'm going to give you the victory. You're not going to win those victories. I'm going to give them to you. Because I'm giving you the land.
Brother James, it's just an observation. You know, when they crossed the river Canaan, when they crossed the Canaan River, you know, they were told to sharpen up their knives. And they were there you know, for several days, you know, during that circumcision. And why wouldn't it be possible that he did drive them out? I mean, he could have drove them out or drove them out of that area because they're left wide open to attack. And the people of Jericho, they're inside a fortified city. They don't meet anybody. They don't have, there's nobody there in their way. Is it not possible that he could have drove them into that city? Is it not possible that he could have protected them, moving them out for the circumcision? Why wouldn't it be?
I'm not sure I'm following.
They're unprotected. They've crossed over the Jordan River. They're going to be sore from circumcision.
Who is unprotected?
The children of Israel.
Uh-uh.
Well, I know they have the Ark of the Covenant with them.
Well, they have the angel.
But why isn't it possible that the hornet could have, it's a possibility that the hornet could have drove them out before they get there?
Could have driven,
The people from Jericho, the
because the people were in Jericho.
yeah, that's where they were. You don't see any contact with anybody when they cross that river.
That's true.
I mean, it is true.
I know.
I agree. I mean,
What text says.
they have no contact with anybody until they get to Jericho.
Yeah.
I mean, why is it not a possibility?
Anything's a possibility with God. Did he do it that way? Unless he tells me that's what he did, I don't know.
Well, so miraculous.
I don't know.
He uses these things. Well, I know we'll have to ask him when we get there.
Thank you, and be careful about
I'll
telling anybody that.
I'll just ask him.
Yes,
We're in
sir.
a class.
I just wanna understand, you're not, when it says the hornet, it's not a specific one hornet, it's the species of hornet. Like, if you're talking about bald eagles, you can say the eagle. Is that why you're saying that?
I don't know whether to fling this on you or not.
Well, it's a big word.
In that case, that would be a synecdoche, where a part would stand for the whole. What I'm saying is, do I know that these are literal hornets that he sent? No. Is there a possibility they were? Yes. Is there also a possibility that they represent what the angel and what Jehovah did miraculously for Israel?
That's all I'm saying.
Yeah. Could that be the case? Yes. Is it? I would not be dogmatic. I don't know.
Well, I wouldn't be either.
I do know, at least it's my judgment, when we get to Joel, we're going to read about the locust coming. It's my judgment there, the locust is an invading army, a real army. But the locusts are used metaphorically to represent it. In that same sense, the hornets could be metaphorical for whatever Jehovah used to drive those people out. And I think that's, instead of getting hung up on, are they real hornets or not? Could that be? Yes, absolutely. We need to go behind what he used and see the fact he's driving them out. That's what he wants Israel to know.
Right.
However I do it, I will be driving them out. So, Don, that's what, in my judgment, is involved. That it's his doing it, however he did it. And when I get to heaven, I'll ask, are they literal or are they not? They could be. I'd have no problem with them being literal.
Well, it makes me think of the plagues as far as what you taught us.
Absolutely.
As far as, you know, he didn't just, picked out randomly flies, frogs. It was for a reason.
Absolutely.
They picked those out because of the gods.
They destroyed one of the gods in Egypt. But I can't go beyond what he says. He says the hornet, but he also says, my angel and I. So could the hornet be a metaphorical reference to what he and the angel would do? Yes, that's a possibility. Could they be literal like the plagues were? Yes, that's a possibility. But I believe we need to get the point that however he did it, literally or metaphorically, it's him doing it. That's what he's trying to say.
That's better explained, Brother James.
I'm sorry.
I said, that's better explained.
Thank you. It's him doing it. And if we're not careful, my fear here is we'll get caught up in the illustration and we'll miss the point. Like we do with marriage in Ephesians 5. The point's Christ and the church. We get caught up in the illustration. So, however it is, that's great. So Jehovah says, I'll send the hornets before you and shall drive them out. And notice he lists these nations again, and these that are listed are representative of all of them. It's the synecdoche, part of them or the whole. But notice this, I will not drive them out from before you in 1 year, lest the land become desolate and the beasts of the field become too numerous for you. So the driving out would be piece by piece by piece. Now he says if I don't do that, then the beast will overrule the land. There won't be enough people there to keep the beast under control. Look at Judges 2. I also will no longer drive out before them any of the nations which Joshua left when he died, so that through them I may test Israel, whether they will keep the ways of Jehovah to walk in them as their fathers kept them or not. Therefore Jehovah left those nations without driving them out. What's the next word? Hastily, immediately. Nor did he deliver them into the hand of Joshua. Now go to 2 Kings 17, and you have the Samaritans, the people in the northern kingdom, taken into Assyria. And they didn't repopulate the land sufficiently. So you go to 2 Kings 17 and verse 25, it was so at the beginning of their dwelling there, verse 24 tells you who the king of Assyria put there, that they did not fear Jehovah, therefore Jehovah sent lions among them, which killed some of them. So they spoke to the king of Assyria, saying, the nations whom you have removed and placed in the cities of Samaria do not know the rituals of the God of the land, therefore he has sent lions among them, and indeed they are killing them because they do not know the rituals of the God of the land. Then the king of Assyria commanded, saying, send there one of the priests whom you brought from there. Let him go and dwell there, and let him teach them the rituals of the God of the land. Then one of the priests whom they had carried away from Samaria came and dwelt in Bethel and taught them how they should fear Jehovah. Now, however, every nation continued to do what? All right, now, what kind of priest did the king of Assyria send back? A calf worship priest. One of the reasons Samaria was carried into captivity. Calf worship. So that priest could not adequately teach, could he? And so they kept on with their idolatry. What's different than that than what Jeroboam the son of Nebat had done? That had made Israel to sin. So they will be driven out, verse 30, little by little I will drive them out from before you until you have increased and you inherit the land. Questions or comments? That's sufficient on the hornet? I'm thankful you and I both live so we can bring your mind to ease. Verse 31, the appointed border of Israel. And I will set your bounds, that would be your boundaries, your borders, from the what? Red Sea. Now see, we thought when we crossed the Red Sea, in 14, we're through with the Red Sea. We aren't through with the Red Sea. I will set your borders from the Red Sea to the sea. All right, what is the sea? That's the Mediterranean. Philistia, and from the desert to the, what do you have there? And that's the Euphrates. For I will deliver the inhabitants of the land into your hand, and you shall drive them out from before you. So from the Red Sea to the Mediterranean, from the wilderness to the Euphrates. Now go to 1 Kings 4. Look at verse 21. So Solomon reigned over all kingdoms from the, you have a river there, Euphrates, to the land of the Philistines, as far as the border of Egypt, that would be the Red Sea. They brought tribute and served Solomon all the days of his life. Verse 24. For he had dominion over all the region on this side of the river, from Tifshah even to Gaza or Gaza, namely over all the kings on this side of the river. And he had made peace on every side all around him. So Solomon extended those borders. But notice that the border would be set by delivering the Canaanites into the hand of Israel. For I will deliver the inhabitants of the land into your hand, and you shall drive them out before you. So in one sense, Jehovah said, I'm driving them out. In another sense, you are going to drive them out. So you have a responsibility. Now, I'll take care of the part you can't handle. You see a parallel there to us? We have a responsibility. We do what our ability allows us to do, and God takes care of the rest of it. Question. The responsibility of Christians is to convert other people.
False.
Why?
Can't convert anybody.
Do what?
You can't really convert anybody, it'll be by the word, our job is to.
All right. So what's our responsibility?
Share the word.
All right. We can't convert. We're to teach. God takes care of the rest of it. How does he take care of the rest of it? Through his word work. We can't convert anybody. If we do, the only thing to which we could convert them would be us. So they'd end up pleasing us and not God. So God says, you do what your responsibility is, and I'll take care of the rest of it. And you shall inhabit that land. I'm driving them out before you. Now look at the uppercase E on your outline. The implication, this writer says, of the whole passage, 20 to 33, is that, mark it, if Israel have obeyed the law of God and walked in his ways, implied, then its people would have been the happiest on earth. God had looked after everything for them. He says it is a sober truth for us all. God has anticipated and looked after everything for us. It depends entirely upon us whether we walk in the way of peace or stray into the bypass of disgrace. Strive to enter in. And there's a difficult way, a confined way. Stay in it. I'll bless you. You get off into the bypass where the majority is, and you'll be lost. Questions or comments? All right, we close the book, 32 and 33, with a final warning against idolatry. The book of the covenant ends as it began, with a solemn warning against idolatry. So he says, you shall make no covenant with them, nor with their Elohim. So don't enter into a covenant with the Canaanites, and don't enter into a covenant with their God. That's interesting. When I take on the worship of something, I enter into a covenant. When I obeyed the gospel, I entered into a covenant with the Lord. If I'm unfaithful, I'm a covenant breaker. And Romans 1 says, God gives up covenant breakers to their own destruction. Now, don't make a covenant with them or their God. See, if they go in and do what God says, there wouldn't be anyone there with whom to make a covenant, and there wouldn't be any idols there with whom or with which to make a covenant. They're to do what?
Utterly destroy them.
All right, verse 33. They shall not dwell in what?
Your land.
All right, right now it's their land. You do what I tell you to do, and it's your land. I'm giving it to you. They shall not dwell in your land. Now here's why. Lest they make you sin against me. For if you serve their gods, it will surely be a snare to you. How could the Canaanites make the Israelites sin against God? I heard it, but I didn't understand.
They'll turn them from God.
Say it one more time.
They will turn them from God,
Two.
idolatry,
All right, how would they do that?
intermarriage. Yeah,
Through their influence.
yeah.
Intermarriage would be the avenue. But there's one word that would cover it all. Now, look at number 1 under C. If the Canaanites are allowed to remain in the land, they will make Israel sin. That's kata'ah. That's that second word for sin, which means to lead someone into sin. The sin would be against Jehovah because it would cause Israel to miss the way Jehovah laid out for them to follow. And sometimes kata'ah carries with it the same idea that hamatino or hamatino does in the New Testament, missing the mark, missing the way. If, the first one translated for if signifies if. The second one translated surely. If you serve the Canaanite gods, surely it will be a snare to you. Turn to Psalms 106. 36. Well, let's start at verse 34. They did not destroy the peoples concerning whom Jehovah had commanded them, so that's step number 1. But instead of destroying them, they mingle with the Gentiles, so there's fellowship. Evil companionships will do what? Corrupt good morals. So when they mingle with them, they learn their works. So they went to school with them and learned. They served their idols because they learned about them, which became a snare to them. They even sacrificed their sons and their daughters to, and we have here, demons. That may involve Molech worship.
Yeah.
Burning them in sacrifice to Molech, the god. Now, uppercase D. We would do well to remember not to make covenants with the idols of our day. And I give you 4 there. 3 particularly: covetousness, self, amusement, style. Number 4, those that would be kept from bad courses must keep from bad company. Other sins will be our snares if we look not well to ourselves. We must always look upon our greatest danger to be from those that would cause us to sin against God. Whatever friendship is pretended, that is really our worst enemy that draws us from our duty. Now here's the word. They'll make you to sin. The avenue they'll use, they're covenant with you. That's how they'll do it. That's how it works today. Oh, it won't hurt just this once. Now you know you'd like to participate in this. Now, the church is not immune to this, folks. If we run with denominational people, we are liable to end up talking like them, thinking like them, and eventually acting like them. And that's why we have some brethren who cannot see any difference in the Lord's church and denominationalism. The Lord's church is a denomination just like the others. They run with those people too long. And we need to be cautious. There's a difference in the Lord's people and the people of the world. And if we don't keep that line drawn, temptation will hit us. Questions or comments? In this chapter, there are some principles of victory for Israel. I'll give you 7 of them. In the first 9 verses, be honest in your dealings with your fellow man. Practice honesty. Verses 10 to 13, protect the land and honor Jehovah for its prosperity. Quit saying, look what I've done. Number 3, provide the feast unto Jehovah according to his instructions. 14 to 19. We might say, worship him faithfully. 4, perform your deeds according to Jehovah's instructions. 20 to 22. Obey him. 5, place your trust in Jehovah's promises. 23 to 28. Faith. There defines faith as trust, a joyful trust that Jesus is the Christ, the Messiah, the author of eternal salvation to those who obey him, conjoined with obedience. 6, patiently work with Jehovah's plan. 29 to 31. Stay faithful. Be obedient. Remain faithful. And number 7, pay attention to Jehovah's warnings. We have warnings through the Bible. If you do this, this is what will happen. All right, so that brings to a conclusion the Book of the Covenant. Now, we've looked at the 10 words and the Book of the Covenant, and I submit to you, the 10 words in the Book of the Covenant make up what we refer to as the Law of Moses. Particularly the 10 words, but also these principles in the Book of the Covenant are involved. For example, if you just take the 10 words without the Book of the Covenant, what would you observe as far as any kind of anything set apart for Jehovah? If you just take the 10 words. Huh? Sabbath day. You'd observe the Sabbath. What about the 3 annual feasts? You learn about them in the Book of the Covenant. What about the Passover, Pentecost, and Tabernacles? The 3 annual feasts. And yet that was a part of Israel's obedience to Jehovah. So take the 10 words and the book of the covenant. And one of the reasons I particularly wanted to get to this is that I found through the years, not many of our people have ever put those together. They stop with the 10 words and say, that's the law. But I hope you can see differently. Any questions or comments now on the book of the covenant? You have listened so faithfully and encouraged me so much. Again, thank you for the wonderful gift. And more thank you for the attitude that is behind it. May God bless you. If it's the Lord's will and the elders' desire, in 23, we'll take up again, Lord willing, hopefully the first Tuesday in January. If